Dear listener, just before we start this show, we just want to make you aware the topics discussed will involve disordered eating and mental health. Welcome to Adventures in Coffee, a podcast by Caffeine magazine sponsored by Oatly.
In this second series, Jools and I explore the world of coffee for those that are curious about what's in their daily cup.
Now, we are all becoming more and more inquisitive about where our food and drink comes from. So we made this podcast in order to unpick the complicated world of coffee and definitely have a few laughs along the way.
I am Scott Bentley and I'm the founder of Caffeine magazine, and some rather rude people call me a coffee dork.
And I'm Jules Walker, a very proud East Londoner and someone that you will quite often find sat on the saddle of a bike and very much your everyday coffee lover. Now, in today's episode, we are going to be exploring the health effects of coffee, Scott.
This was a story that you wanted to do. Could you tell us, our dear listener, where this has come from? Why do you want to do this story?
Well, Scott, as you know, we've talked about this in previous series where I've disclosed that I've had issues with my mental health. And, you know, like several years ago, all of these issues that I was having was actually colliding with my dietary requirements that I was putting on myself. And many, many moons ago, caffeine fell into the category of one of the worst things that I could possibly be putting into my body. And although I absolutely love my coffee, I was of the firm belief that I needed to get rid of this thing, this toxin, this evil substance that I was putting in my body because it would make me a better person. So I was someone who experimented with quite a few fad diets. So there was the Atkins Diet. I tried that for a while. I went through ketosis. I stopped eating carbs. I took sugar out of my diet as well. I did the paleo eating diet. And every time I went through one of these like fad diets, it was just like, well, this doesn't seem to be working. This doesn't seem to be fixing everything for me. My brain doesn't seem to be in a better place. I'm still a terrible person. I need to move on to the next one. I've got to try what the next one is. But I've never really had an answer to the question, is coffee actually killing me?
Yeah. It's interesting, Jules, because I've heard lots of stuff about this. We've been sent lots of stuff into the magazine about the health effects of coffee. So, yeah, I'm very curious about your story and about where this takes us.
So, you know, I've spoken to some incredible people where we're going to be looking at the scientific element of it. So that's going to be covered. We're actually going to be looking at the history of coffee as well, and, you know, digging into where coffee and caffeine started to get its bad rap. And we're going to be going back 150 years in this exploration.
Going way back.
Way back. And I also spoke to a psychologist about this too. Now, this is where it gets quite personal on my journey with coffee because of my relationship that I've had with disordered eating. You know, in speaking to a psychologist, we can explore what our relationship is with food and mental health, how we should be broaching it. Even you, as the king of caffeine, may be surprised at some of the stuff that we're going to uncover.
I'm looking forward to it, Jules.
But before we embark upon this big journey, let's have a quick word from our sponsor. And now here is a sustainability hack brought to you by Oatly.
Jules, if I remember rightly, you said that you were going to invite me over for a bit of a meal at some point because your mum's cooking was off the chart. Tell me what we're eating.
All right, you're coming over on a Sunday, so therefore you're going to have Mama Velo's traditional Trinidadian cookout. So there will be a big pot of callaloo going, which is a spinach-based dish that's got crab in it. You've got okra in there as well. The seasonings are incredible.
Just
the drool. The drool.
Drool off my face. Now, I am thinking that kitchen's hot, isn't it?
Oh, God, yeah, it's like being in a sauna.
Okay, Jules, you know we're doing these sustainability hacks which have been sent to us by our lovely friends at Oatly.
Yeah.
One of these, putting a lid on each of those pans, saves 3% energy, and that mounts up. I mean, you've got, how many pots you got on the boil there? You got 6 going on.
This is about 6.
If she and everybody else in the UK put lids on pans, do you know that would save 84,000 tons of CO2 a year, about the weight of 120,000 blue whales Can you tell Mama Velo to put a lid on it?
Would you like to come and tell Mama Velo to put a lid on it? You're more than welcome to do that.
I'm not teaching Mama Velo how to suck eggs. I'm telling you that from nothing.
And that was a sustainability hack brought to you by Oatly.
All right, Jules, crash and burn all my dreams. Is coffee killing me?
Well, I'm not going to crash and burn on your dreams, babe, but I wanted to get the absolute and more definitive expert answer to the question. So I called up this person.
I am Dr. Charlotte Mills. I am a lecturer in human nutrition at the University of Reading within the Hugh Sinclair Human Nutrition Unit. Started off my PhD in coffee back in 2009, and I've been kind of researching on coffee and the areas around it for the last 12 years.
Wow, you brought up the big guns, didn't you, Jules?
I told you we were going deep with this one, Scott.
Okay, heavy hitters. What does she have to say?
We had so many wide-ranging conversations about this topic because there have been many studies done in the past and so many are being done today as well. But this is what Dr. Charlotte Mills' opinion on it was.
I would be extremely surprised if the evidence showed that coffee was so bad that, it was going to be phased out. I think the evidence really is pointing towards there being beneficial associations with coffee consumption. I would be so shocked if we did some massive trials and suddenly it was like, oh God, we all need to stop drinking. I'd be extremely sad because I really enjoy drinking coffee, but also I'd be extremely shocked if that was the outcome.
Oh, okay, great. So brilliant. There's evidence that it's good for us. Hurrah!
I knew that would please you, Scott. So listen to this because she spoke about how coffee is actually good for us.
I think there's a lot of evidence leaning towards beneficial effects of coffee. So there's a lot of data showing reductions in type 2 diabetes incidence, reduction of cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative diseases, reductions in cancer, so liver cancer, for example. So I think that there seems to be more saying that it's not going to be detrimental to your long-term health than to say it would be detrimental to your long-term health.
Great. This is a short episode, Jules. We can wrap it up here.
Oh, no, Scott, my friend. It is not that because we go a little bit deeper here because Dr. Charlotte Mills actually brought up one of the compounds as well, which is acrylamide. Now, acrylamide is found when you cook things that don't have much moisture at high temperature. So things like crisps, bread, biscuits, and what happens to coffee during the roasting process. And so scientists are actually looking into whether it's a possible carcinogen.
What did your expert have to say about it?
But I think all of the association data at the moment is saying that coffee is associated with reductions in cancers. So I'd be surprised if the levels of acrylamide in coffee were causing great concern.
All right, Jules, yeah. She's saying it may be a carcinogen. So two things I would say here. Number one, it may be. It isn't necessarily, and it hasn't been proven. Number two, even if it is in such small amounts that it will make virtually no difference. I mean, here's a point. Mm-hmm. We all love an apple. In apple pips, there is cyanide. So what you could say is that, by eating an apple, you could be possibly killing yourself. The reality is you'd have to eat a whole bucket of apple pips to get anywhere near that cyanide levels to kill you. And that's never going to happen.
Scott, I get you. And this is, what Dr. Charlotte Mills and I talked about as well. The thing is that we need to make this distinction between acrylamides and something like cigarettes where we know that there is a bad outcome. Okay, so listen to how Dr. Charlotte Mills spoke about cigarettes and then contrast this with how she spoke about coffee.
I think now we kind of completely unequivocally accept that smoking is not good for us, right?
Yeah.
I think that there's been enough evidence there to prove that, and that's now being implemented within public health messaging. And, you go to your GP, they're helping you quit smoking. There are other alternatives to help you quit smoking. I think the evidence there is extremely strong.
Yeah, this is good because listening to a health professional, the way in which she discusses these topics are starkly different. One of them is, I'll be surprised if this is the situation. Whereas when we talk about something knownly cancerous like cigarettes, is kind of like, no, there is evidence. There is enough evidence over a sustained period of time that these things are cancerous. So there's a stark difference in how she's discussing acrylamide versus cigarettes.
But here's the really interesting thing, Scott. If we go way back in time, like back to the 60s and the 70s, there were many correlation studies back then that were saying that coffee is bad for us. These studies, they looked at a big group of people, and it did seem to appear that these people who drank coffee actually had worse health outcomes. And Dr. Mills spoke on this.
Historically, coffee has had a bad press. Dating back to some of the original studies looking at coffee and health, a lot of the outcomes for those were less positive. And I think even though science has moved on, obviously nutritional science is evolving like all sciences are. We discover new things, some of our techniques and methods become advanced. And now the thinking is that coffee isn't quite as bad as what it was made out kind of back in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Why is that? I mean, what are the historical reasons as to why coffee was, I don't know, just seen as sort of like an evil in your kitchen almost, that it was a thing that you just needed to cut out?
I mean, it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly why. I have theories, and they're kind of theories that are spoken about generally around that, and a lot of that is around behaviours which are associated with coffee consumption. So these are things like smoking, which we now are quite certain is detrimental to health, but coffee consumption and smoking were very well associated, and lots of these historical studies perhaps didn't adjust their data for that relationship. Also things like sedentary behaviour. So you have a cup of coffee. It's slightly different now because we have a coffee shop culture where we're running around drinking our coffee, but historically we were probably sitting down having a cup of coffee, and it was associated with more sedentary behaviours, and perhaps they weren't accounted for in the data as well.
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing about it, is that, coffee drinkers tended to be smokers, and they didn't seem to exercise as much. But coffee wasn't the thing that was the problem. It was more to do with the fact that they were smoking, which isn't good for you, and not exercising, and people just happened to be drinking coffee as well. Now, the thing is, Scott, there were these association studies. They found a big group of people to look at and look for correlations. Now, this is quite often the first step in a long line of steps to then setting up really carefully controlled trials to find causations.
So essentially what you're saying is coffee never really got the benefit of the doubt on this. It was just sort of like slapped as the bad guy. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Does Dr. Mills know why that happened?
I asked her.
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Obviously, there are other drinks that include caffeine, right? Tea. We're a nation of tea lovers. Why is it that everybody jumped onto coffee in such a negative way? And I really have no idea why that might have been.
And Scott, guess what? I think I might have an answer to that.
Tell me, Jools, tell me. I'm desperate to know.
Jonathan, how are you keeping?
I'm great, thanks. Nice to hear from you.
It's nice to...
Okay, that was a quick switch. We're now speaking to Jonathan Morris.
We are Professor Jonathan Morris, who I had a conversation with, and he's actually a research professor in modern history at the University of Hertfordshire and an expert on the global history of coffee. So what we're going to be looking at now, Scott, is a story that actually begins 120 years ago. Now, people drank loads of coffee back then, but while that's happening, the health fads are actually really becoming a big thing.
So start with a figure that we actually probably still know, a certain Mr. John Kellogg.
Oh, that's the dude that made cornflakes, yeah?
The cornflake dude, yes, the very same one.
So Kellogg was very into health. He sets up lots of sort of wellness facilities. And of course, he's also manufacturing products that he says, this will give you literally, health in your bowl in the morning, the Kellogg cereal.
So Mr. Kellogg was very much into health, right? And he set up essentially a massive health centre. So it was this massive complex of buildings that eventually numbers about 30 across 30 acres with a capacity for 1,000 guests.
Well, this all sounds a bit sort of cultish. What was his shtick? What was he doing in these health centres? in air quotes, health centres.
Mr. Kellogg was all about encouraging healthy living, right? So he encouraged things like low-fat, low-protein diets with an emphasis on whole grains, fibre-rich foods, and probably more importantly, nuts. Now, Mr. Kellogg, the cereal dude, also recommended a daily intake of fresh air, a bit of exercise, and the importance of practicing good hygiene.
I mean, this sounds like a lot of the things that we still hear today. So, I mean, I'm gathering this is all pretty decent. This is all fine. What's not to like about this guy? And at the end of the day, what's this got to do with coffee, Jules?
Well, Scott, Mr. Kellogg made a coffee substitute.
I don't like him anymore.
One of the things I didn't know about Kellogg was that Kellogg also made something which he called caramel coffee, which had no coffee in it, of course, but was sort of, a kind of a substitute thing. Now, one of Kellogg's disciples is a guy called Post. I think it's William Post. Mm-hmm. And he was very, very highly strung, seemed to go through lots of nervous activity, ran around sort of founding lots of businesses and what have you without actually ever delivering anything, and then having nervous collapses when it didn't all work out.
Oh dear.
And he went and stayed with Kellogg, and Kellogg tried to educate him. But nonetheless, after a while, he saw Kellogg's caramel coffee, and he sort of developed his own, again, his entrepreneurial side clicked in. And he started developing a coffee substitute that he called Postum.
Postum? What the hell's Postum? I've never heard of that.
It's a bit different. Basically, you end up getting some grain, maybe something like barley. You roast it up, grind it, and then you brew it like coffee.
Oh, man, that sounds disgusting. Is that like chicory? Is that chicory coffee stuff? I don't know.
Yeah, well, you mentioned chicory, Scott, but around about that time, there were quite a few coffee substitutes around.
Coffee. So we used to have acorn coffee, dandelion coffee, chicory coffee. I mean, I don't know, Jules, you're so young, you won't remember camp coffee, will you?
I don't think so. I don't know. All right, Scott, there were lots of different alternative coffees around at the time, but Postum was different because the inventor, William Post,
he was incredibly successful. So he basically was the fastest person to go from a startup to a millionaire, and a millionaire in those days is a lot. In 7 years, the first time that he made Postum is 1895, yeah? Mm-hmm. And 7 years later, this guy is a millionaire.
That's insane.
That's a big impact.
All right, so this dude is like Elon Musk of coffee of 100 years ago,
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, so he pretty much was, as you say, the Elon Musk of his day. And Jonathan actually told me the story of a pretty big guy in the coffee business who wrote about Post in one of the coffee and tea journals.
You mean they had Caffeine Magazine before Caffeine Magazine was out?
I don't even know how to answer that because I don't want you to, I don't want to bruise your ego, babe, so yeah.
And apparently Post gave his daughter $2 million when they got married.
As you do.
Rather nice, isn't it?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind that.
But then he goes on, what's $2 million to Post? Because he spends $1.5 million every year just on advertising.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, so again, you put that $1.5 million a year. Now, that wouldn't be an insubstantive budget now.
Yeah.
But in 1900s, we're talking huge.
And Scott,
Yeah.
guess what made him so successful?
I don't know. I'm kind of a bit stumped, really. So essentially, he just advertised his way to this. Is that what's going on here?
Scott, listen to this.
He's brilliant at negative advertising.
Oh, yeah. Go on.
So the very clever thing that he did was essentially make people scared to drink coffee. And then, of course, if you've got the fear about this terrible thing that's going to be really bad for you, you offer them an alternative. His alternative, which was Postum.
And what was his scare tactics? How did he get people scared about coffee?
This is genuinely amazing, and Jonathan shared some incredible examples of this with me.
I mean, one of the things he used to do was obviously he would use people's stories that they would tell him about, how stopping coffee and drinking Postum had made them so much better. But they told him that for a simple reason, which was they used to put ads in magazines basically saying, write me a letter telling me how good Postum has been for you, and I will promise you, and it actually, this is what it says, many greenbacks. Here's one that he published. It goes, I was a coffee slave. I had headaches every day. As soon as I took Postum, all my troubles vanished. My rheumatism is gone entirely. My blood is pure. My nerves are practically well and steady. My digestion is perfect. I never have sick headaches anymore.
Oh, wow. So this is serious cash for quotes that's going on.
Yeah. And he used to always end, a lot of his ads would end, "There's a reason." That would be all it says. So there's a reason. And obviously what it's allowing the target audience to do is they're thinking of the reasons. And he gives them a few little lines, coffee heart, coffee neuralgia, brain fag. This one is incredible, this ad here. It had a picture of coffee coming out of a cup and the text goes, "Constant dripping wears away the stone. Perhaps a hole has been started in you. Try leaving off coffee for 10 days and you postman food coffee."
I mean, this just wouldn't happen today, would it? I mean, there's obviously no such thing as advertising standards. It's pure snake oil.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm flabbergasted, but I'm kind of thinking the guy's a genius. I mean, they used to say that cigarettes helped your breathing, didn't they? I mean, it's like they used to get away with all sorts of stuff.
Yep. And get this. Do you want to know something else that's really crazy?
If it can get any more bizarre, please tell me.
Yes. William Post was a secret coffee drinker.
Oh, God, of course he was. Of course he was. Oh, my God.
See, he was. But here's the thing. So you had this guy shilling this alternative, even though he was knocking back the caffeine himself. And also at the time, the coffee industry was doing a really quite terrible job at fighting back.
So how did the coffee industry kind of repel this? What were their ads like?
Aha. Well, Jonathan actually spoke about this as well.
The ads would go something like, does your coffee give you bad stomachache? Well, switch to my fantastic coffee. But of course, what stuck in the public's mind was then, and what Postum would phrase on was, well, where did you think that stomachache came from? It comes from coffee. It's all bad for you, yeah?
Yeah, no, they've got themselves in a bit of a mix, haven't they? You're right. They're all just infighting, like trying to get a few customers off of each other.
Scott, the whole thing was, as the kids say today, a hot mess, right? And around about the same time as all of this kicking off, decaf coffee came along as well.
So this is another thing to throw into the mix then.
Uh-huh. You see where this is going?
So there's another thing whereby coffee companies are actually now advertising decaffeinated coffee. Well, if you're decaffeinating your coffee, what's wrong with coffee?
Wow. It's like, I don't know, disaster after disaster.
And those studies that we talked about in the 60s and the 70s that were coming out about coffee being bad for you? Well, the coffee industry reacted in the same way.
And again, what happens is that the coffee companies are very mixed in their reaction, because although they try and sponsor some science to debunk this, what they also do is push heavy again on the decaf. So decaf becomes about 25% plus of the market by the early 80s. And of course, what you're really saying there again is, yeah, there is an issue. The more you push decaf, the more you're actually getting people to, again, make that association. Well, if we need decaf, what's wrong with coffee? Why do we need this? Why are you giving us that?
God, will they ever learn? So the way I'm looking at this, Jools, essentially, this one dude that wanted to push his coffee alternative made this lie to essentially sell his thing, which has then gone on for the next 70 and 80 years of people just keep repeating this same false information.
And you know what, Scott? Jonathan essentially said the same thing.
Well, I think the legacy is simply that this cloud of suspicion has hung over coffee ever since. Because although we have many studies now that show, as we say, drunk in moderation, coffee can actually be quite good for you. I think one of the revealing things is I don't think you'll ever find a coffee company that would dare advertise coffee as a wellness product, even though we now know that actually there is quite a lot that could be said in that favour. We could have an ad that read, coffee, this is good for preventing your bowel cancer. You could run that, it would be true.
Yeah.
No one will ever run it. And we won't run it because there's too much in the collective human psyche about coffee being bad for us.
This is really interesting to me, Jools, because Here, I mean, in the coffee industry now, we see many new products coming to market. I mean, what I suppose I'm specifically thinking about is like CBD products. And I'm seeing a lot of people making a lot of claims about what CBD can do. And yet that's relatively nuanced, and it's really, really new stuff and new science, which hasn't really been proven yet. And yet we have proof that coffee is good for you. And yet Jonathan's right. No one will put this, in a wellness aisle or in a health food shop.
Now, Scott, we've looked at the science and we've looked at the history that sits behind the health aspects of coffee. But we talked about this at the start. My original reasoning for actually wanting to go on this journey was because of my own personal relationship with disordered eating and the role that caffeine and coffee and the relationship that I had with it wasn't great, because it was something that I felt like I had to expel from my life in order to be a better person, because it was this terrible toxin that I was putting into my body that wasn't doing me any good. And, the road to happiness would be expelling things like coffee and caffeine out of my system. So I wanted to look at the psychology behind all of this. And to do so, I spoke with Kimberley Wilson to try and understand what some of the psychological reasons are behind, like the clean eating Instagram trends that we see. And ultimately, we wanted to find out what is a better way to approach nutrition and mental health and coffee.
My name is Kimberley Wilson. I'm a Chartered Psychologist with a master's degree in nutrition, and I look at the relationship between nutrition, lifestyle and brain health, and in particular, the effect of diet and nutrients on the structure and function of our brains.
There's no fluffy people in this, is there?
No.
There's no fluffy people in this episode. You brought out some serious people.
Kimberley Wilson is wonderful. So as she's mentioned, she's a chartered psychologist. People came to know Kimberley through her appearance on The Great British Bake Off, which is an incredible show. And she has a huge following on her social media, where she's got like nearly 75,000 people following her. And she does these really insightful Instagram lives about your relationship with food and your mental health and the psychology behind it. All right, Scott. So clean eating trends, they tend to take a very simple approach to being more healthy. And it's as straightforward as just cut that stuff out. And this is what Post preyed on as well. So I wanted to find out from Kimberley why this kind of method is so effective. And interestingly enough, it all has to do with mental shortcuts.
One of the psychological aspects is our drive for simplicity. We want a simple answer. Complexity is stressful. It takes a lot of time. Our brains are driven to find what we call heuristics, which are just rules of thumb. Do this, don't do that. And heuristics are useful because it reduces the amount of processing that you have to do about the information that's coming into your life. So if you go out into the world, and if you were just living reactively, you would have to react to every single car that is driving down the road, to every single person that you encounter as you walk down the street. Every single shift and change would require a different processing response. And simply, our brain doesn't have the capacity to do that. Energetically, it would just be too demanding to do that. So actually, most of what your brain does is prediction based on previous experience and heuristics, rules of thumb. What's easier? Let me just apply this rule to everything, cross my fingers, and we'll be fine. But it often leads us down a trap when actually the situation is much more complex than that.
Okay, so what Post got right, essentially Postum was taking, many people had many different health problems in that time, and he's just simply saying, coffee's your problem, drink Postum instead, and all your problems are like magically solved.
Bingo. See, the thing is, Scott, what I've found with these clean eating trends is that, there's this element of being told to lower or avoid taking certain things into your system, i.e. like what we're talking about with caffeine or like sugar, stuff like that. And, at some point it's going to equal a much better you. And, like we said earlier on in the episodes, the whole thing with acrylamide, it's like, oh, they're bad. Like this is a no-no. But after speaking with Kimberley, we've discovered that it's actually so much more complex than that.
But also, let's remember that essentially living is carcinogenic. Like, the act of being alive and metabolizing is producing tiny precancerous cells. That the reason you have an immune system is that it goes around and it's sweeping that up. No, of course, you don't want to overload it, but we cannot pretend that we can protect ourselves from everything. And this is the wish, this is the kind of fantasy of clean eating and wellness, is that if I just work hard enough, if I eat cleanly enough, I have the hubris of thinking that I can avoid death. It's not going to happen.
It seems like there's a lot of ways in which we shouldn't be thinking about food and coffee and drink and everything, really. But does she have any insight into how we should be thinking about these sort of things?
She did. And yet again, Kimberley had two amazing insights to share on this. And the first is that there is no one size fits all. Do you know what I mean? It's just let people eat.
And we absolutely need to move away from any semblance of the idea that there is one diet to rule them all. Like, it doesn't make sense on any biological level, right? For example, the idea that the foods that I should be eating and the quantities and the composition should be the same as you makes no sense. Not in terms of genetics, not in terms of microbiome, not in terms of my metabolism, my energy expenditure. All of our needs for nutrients are completely different. It doesn't make sense to think that one way of eating will suit everyone. But also, it doesn't make sense that one way of eating will suit one person for their entire lifespan.
Yeah.
Because if that were the case, I'd still be drinking breast milk. It doesn't make sense. Our nutritional needs change with various features of our lives, our genetics, our gender, and our lifespan. The foods that we're eating when we're 17 probably shouldn't be the same composition of foods that we're eating when we're 75. So we need to come back to this idea that it's complex and complicated, and that it will take time and it takes trial and error and effort to find the way of eating that works for you. Just let people eat stuff.
Just let people be.
Just let people live.
Yeah,
let me live.
Just live. Honestly, let me live. I think it's just that needs to be on the t-shirt. Just a let me live.
I mean, I think she makes so many great points. I love this idea that, you know, what we eat when we're like 16, 17 should not be the same things as we eat now, and probably shouldn't be the same things that we eat when we're elderly. And that just makes so much sense. But I think the problem here is that we just want a simple life. And it comes back to that first thing, the first reason that Postum kind of got so right, is that we just want simplicity. And so if somebody says to us, don't eat this, do eat that, then people find comfort in that.
This is why it was so insightful speaking to her. And you're absolutely right that, you know, simplicity is the thing that I guess would work, but simplicity isn't the answer. That's not going to be an answer for everyone, in the same way that I discovered, like, when I cut out caffeine, that was it. It was going to be fine. It wasn't. I decided I was going to try and maintain myself on something like the paleo diet. That was not sustainable for me at all for many reasons. So, Scott, there was the first piece of advice that Kimberley gave us in regards to just, you know, letting people eat. Because at the end of the day, there is no one diet to rule them all. It isn't one size fits all for people in that sense. But then there was a second piece of advice that Kimberley gave to me as well, which I want to share with you, on how we could be doing nutrition better. It's about focusing on your brain, and this is how Kimberley put it.
What I would love to see is children being taught how to feed their brains, right? Here is the most important organ in your entire body. It's incredible. It's wonderful. Here are the ways that you can look after it. And what's nice about that is that it would move away from aesthetics. It moves us away from, you know, should all girls weigh 9 stone and all of this stuff, and move us towards actually real care. You know, I'm taking care of a part of me that no one else can see. They're not going to judge me on it. I can't do a brain selfie. It's really about thinking, how am I going to take care of this incredible organ? This isn't about someone else praising you for your weight loss. It's really about you having a better mood, you having better concentration, you reducing your risk of mental health disorders, which are we increasingly is seen to be nutrient associated, and down the line reducing your risk of things like Alzheimer's disease. So that is the position I would be. If the government were to take that position, I would literally, you could knock me down with a feather.
I mean, that's really great. So, tell me simply, what should I be eating? Tell me exactly what I need to eat.
Okay, well, I spoke to Kimberley about this as well, and it's actually pretty simple, Scott.
Most of the information about eating well is very, very boring, and you've heard it 7 million times. Eat vegetables, a lot of them, whole grains, essential fats, fruit, and keep everything else down to a, manageable, enjoyable minimum.
And Scott, do you know what else?
Go on.
Drink coffee.
Yay!
I knew that would please you.
But in most of the large dietary studies that look at the impact of overall diet on long-term health outcomes, brain health outcomes, depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's disease, coffee sits in one of the key groups that are beneficial. So, we start with the omega-3s, then we go like vegetables, whole grains, and then polyphenol-rich foods. So your blueberries, your, brightly coloured fruits and vegetables. But then tea and coffee. Tea and coffee are included in the recommendations for a brain-healthy diet in studies across the world. Broadly, as long as it's not impairing your sleep, that's kind of the only real danger. If it's not impairing your sleep and not giving you heart palpitations, somewhere between 200 and 500 milligrams of caffeine per day is not associated with any harms, and is more associated with benefits both for physical and mental and brain health.
Thank God. I mean, it's only taken us like 40 minutes to get here.
All you wanted to hear was drink coffee. That's what you wanted, wasn't it?
Yeah, we could have made this episode so much shorter, Jules. You could have just said, I spoke to a really lovely lady called Kimberley. She said it does great stuff for your brain. I mean, this has been an incredible journey for me, learning, where all this stuff has come from. But maybe you can let our dear listener know, and myself as well, how your journey has been from you being in the sort of the depths of these sort of fad diets to where you are now, because it sounds like you're much more at ease with how you eat and what you eat.
A lot of people out there, including myself, have been told and basically force-fed the idea that this is a terrible toxin that you're putting into your body and it is making your life terrible. And it was breaking that pattern of thought and that conditioning that I had. It was actually trying to listen to myself instead of all of the voices and all of the other things that were influencing me into believing that almost everything that I was consuming was bad. It's still an ongoing process, but I'm at a point where I wouldn't say that I found absolute peace with everything, but I'm definitely in a better place with it. But it was working out, just as Kimberley touched upon as well, we're all different, we're all different people. What works for one person is not necessarily going to work for the next. And I had to discover what it is that worked for me, instead of either trying to squeeze myself into this health and well-being and dietary box that I just assumed was going to be great because social media and other platforms out there were telling me it was going to be good. It's, on a very personal and selfish level, I needed to go on this journey. It was just finding out or trying to unpack my reasons for why I decided to cut caffeine out of my life, and then not feeling guilty for enjoying it again, for bringing it back in. I'm not a bad person because I decided that, actually I like drinking flat whites. I like having an espresso. I shouldn't feel like I'm going to go to, and as Kimberley put it, some kind of dietary hell for enjoying these things that give you pleasure.
Jules, another great episode. I think it's time for the credits.
Here we go. This podcast was produced by James Harper, the creator of the coffee podcast Filter Stories.
He also writes and plays the piano music. If you like the show, please subscribe on your podcast app. And you can also help others find the show by leaving a 5-star review, obviously, on Apple Podcasts.
Now, as you know, we're all on social media, and you can follow Caffeine Magazine on Instagram. So that's Scott at Caffeine Mag, myself, Jools at Lady Velo, and of course, James Harper at Filter Stories Podcast.
Now tell us, how many cups of coffee do you drink a day? And maybe more importantly, are you drinking enough for a healthy brain?
Now, you can follow Kimberley Wilson on Instagram at Food and Psych, and we've actually put a link to her book, How to Build a Healthy Brain, in the show notes.
You can also pick up a copy of Jonathan Morris's book, Coffee, A Global History, there as well as a History of Coffee podcast series that he created along with our producer, James Harper.
Now, in our next episode, we're actually going to be bringing you the first of our mini-series, Adventures in Your Kitchen.
Now, we're going to help you master the humble coffee bean and answer all your questions. Jules, what are we going to be discussing first?
Oh, Scott, we're going to be answering the eternal question, should I invest in an espresso machine?
And as a seasoned espresso veteran, I'll take you through the pros, the cons of embarking on this journey, what price brackets you're going to be looking for, maybe some of those red flags to watch out for when scouring the internet for your new favourite hobby.
But until then, dear listener, thank you for spending some time with us. Take care of yourselves, and we will speak to you again in a couple of weeks.